Imagine waking up to the distant sound of a temple bell echoing through a misty valley. The year is 1550, and you find yourself in the heart of feudal Japan, a land of breathtaking beauty and unrelenting discipline. The cherry blossoms drift in the morning air, but behind their fragile beauty lies a world where survival depends on obedience, honor, and luck. In this world, your every breath would be measured by your place in the social order, and your fate could change in a single heartbeat. Before we step into this world of samurai, peasants, and emperors, take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and settle in. This is History for Sleep, where we explore the stories of the past not just to learn, but to drift peacefully into rest. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tap the bell so you don't miss our next journey through time. Leave a comment and tell us what corners of history you'd like to wander through next and when you usually listen. Do you drift off during the first few minutes, or do you like to listen all the way through till morning? Tonight, we'll travel together into a place where life was as delicate as a falling blossom and as dangerous as the sword of a samurai. We'll explore the beauty, the brutality, and the endless hierarchy that defined every life. From the peasants who toiled in rice fields to the warriors bound by impossible codes of honor, we'll discover why most of us wouldn't last a single day in feudal Japan. So close your eyes if you wish, let the sounds of history carry you away, and together we'll begin this quiet descent into the past. The first light of dawn in feudal Japan was not the gentle awakening of leisure, but a summons to duty. The morning began before the sun rose, with the sound of roosters echoing through misty rice paddies and the creak of wooden homes stirring to life. For most, sleep was not a luxury to indulge in, but a short reprieve from relentless toil. The air was cool and heavy, with the scent of damp earth and smoke from smoldering embers that had burned through the night. Even before the sky brightened, the village was already alive with quiet motion. A peasant's home was a single room of packed earth floors and bamboo walls, its roof made from straw that needed constant repair. The family slept side by side, often on straw mats or woven reed beds, covered in simple cotton blankets if they were fortunate. There was no privacy, and the faint glow from a single oil lamp cast long shadows on the wooden beams. As the dawn deepened, the family stirred in silence, each knowing their tasks by heart. The men would rise to tend to the animals or prepare tools for the fields, while the women kindled the morning fire and prepared the meager breakfast, usually rice gruel, if there was rice at all, or barley, and millet for those who could not afford the finer grain. Outside, the landscape seemed almost ethereal. Mist drifted lazily over flooded rice paddies, reflecting the pale orange hue of the rising sun. The rhythm of the day was set not by clocks, but by the natural flow of light and shadow. In this early hour, the peasants walked barefoot through muddy paths, balancing buckets or bundles on their shoulders with quiet endurance. Their lives were bound to the seasons and the whims of nature. A drought, a storm, or a poor harvest could mean hunger for months or even death. Yet there was a stillness to these mornings, a kind of calm acceptance, born of necessity and generations of repetition. In the distance, the faint call of a temple bell signaled the monks' morning prayers. Its soft, resonant sound rippled across the valley, blending with the rustle of wind through bamboo groves. Religion was not separate from life. It was woven into every breath, every bow, every offering of incense. Even those who could barely afford to eat would sometimes bring a small handful of rice to the local shrine, praying for good weather, healthy children, or the mercy of the gods. The people of feudal Japan lived close to both nature and the divine, but always under the weight of duty. As the morning progressed, the samurai estates also came to life. Behind tall wooden walls and tiled roofs, retainers and servants prepared for their master's day. A samurai might rise early to practice with his sword or recite passages from philosophical texts that guided his sense of honor. While peasants worked to survive, The samurai trained to serve, bound by the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Honor was everything, and shame could destroy a man faster than a blade. To live by duty and die without hesitation was the ideal, even if the reality was far more complicated. Not every samurai was noble or skilled, and not every peasant was ignorant or weak. But each was confined by the same system or web of loyalty and obedience that defined one's worth from birth. For those within castle towns, the mornings carried a different soundscape. The clatter of merchants setting up their stalls, the hum of apprentices sweeping doorways, and the rhythmic beat of craftsmen's tools against wood and metal. The smell of charcoal smoke, soy sauce brewing, and steamed rice filled the narrow streets. The merchants, though often wealthier than peasants, occupied a low place in society. Money was considered less honorable than land or service. Still, the market bustled each morning as they quietly sustained the towns and villages through their trade. Children, too, played their part. Boys fetched water or helped their fathers mend fences, while girls helped wash rice or sweep the home. Laughter was rare but precious, echoing softly between moments of duty. They grew up fast in this world, learning their roles early, understanding that a single mistake could mean punishment or disgrace for the entire family. The rising sun soon climbed higher, and the mist began to dissolve. From the fields, the sound of water flowing through irrigation channels filled the air, joined by the rhythmic squelch of bare feet in the mud. Farmers bent low, planting each seedling with careful precision. This back-breaking work consumed their days, leaving their hands rough and their backs permanently bent. Yet even in such hardship, there was a quiet pride, a sense that they were part of something larger, serving not just their lord, but the land itself. By the time the morning reached its full brightness, the village had already settled into the rhythm of survival. Every movement was deliberate, every breath earned. The beauty of feudal Japan was undeniable. The snow-capped mountains, the shimmering rice terraces, the gentle flow of rivers beneath ancient bridges. But behind that beauty was an existence built on endless labor, discipline, and silence. If you were to awaken there one morning, surrounded by mist and ritual, you would feel the weight of it immediately. The serenity would draw you in, but the demands of survival would leave you gasping. To last even a single day in feudal Japan, you would need more than strength. You would need endurance, humility, and a spirit molded by generations of obedience. As the morning sun climbed higher, life continued its quiet dance, as it had for centuries, indifferent to who could or could not keep up. To survive in feudal Japan, one first had to understand the invisible walls that shaped society. These walls were not made of stone, but of rank, duty, and honor. Every person belonged to a specific class, and from the moment of birth, your place was fixed like ink on parchment. To step beyond it, even slightly, could bring ruin not only to yourself, but to your entire family. The concept of hierarchy was so deeply woven into the culture that it determined how you walked, spoke, bowed, and even breathed around others. At the top of this pyramid stood the emperor, a divine figure believed to be descended from the gods themselves. Yet, in practice, his power was mostly symbolic. The real authority lay with the shogun, the military ruler who controlled the armies and the land. Beneath him were the daimyo, powerful lords who governed vast territories, each commanding armies of samurai who swore loyalty unto death. Beneath them came the peasants, the artisans, and the merchants. At the very bottom beneath even recognition were the outcasts, the burakumin, who handled death, leatherwork, or anything considered impure. For a samurai, life revolved around the concept of honor, or bushido. It was not just a code of ethics, but a way of life that demanded discipline in every breath. To show fear was shameful, to fail one's master was unforgivable, and to die for duty was glorious. The samurai's life was governed by the blade, and death was always close. A mistake, a word out of place, or an act of disobedience could lead to seppuku ritual suicide, performed to restore lost honor. Imagine living with that weight pressing on your mind every day, knowing that even your death must be performed with grace and precision. For the peasants, the burden was different, but no less heavy. They were considered essential, for they provided the rice that sustained the nation. Yet despite their importance, they lived under crushing taxes and endless labor. A bad harvest could mean starvation, and rebellion was not an option. The government viewed peasants as property of their lords, and the lords in turn viewed them as tools for production. Still, the peasants accepted their place, believing it was part of the natural order. A peasant who dared to look a samurai in the eye or failed to bow deeply enough risked being struck down on the spot. It was not cruelty as much as custom and order, so ingrained that it felt like the law of the universe itself. Artisans held a curious position in society. They crafted the objects that defined Japanese culture: beautiful lacquerware, intricate ceramics, silk garments, and delicate swords, but were ranked below the peasants who worked the soil. Despite their skill, they were not considered honorable because they did not directly produce food. Still, many artisans found quiet pride in their craft. Their creations outlived them, carried into temples, castles, and households across generations. In their meticulous work, they found purpose and dignity in a society that often refused to grant them status. The merchants, too, lived in contradiction. They were often wealthier than anyone else, especially in the later centuries of feudal rule, but they were seen as parasites profiting from the labor of others rather than contributing directly. To the samurai, money was a taint. Wealth without honor was meaningless. But the merchants understood something others did not, that silver and rice could buy influence in subtle ways. Behind closed doors, deals were struck, favors exchanged, and entire fortunes hidden beneath humble facades. The merchant's life was one of quiet cunning, always aware that power must remain unseen to be safe. Then there were those who existed outside the system altogether. The outcasts lived on the edges of villages, often forbidden from entering temples or marrying into respectable families. They were the tanners, butchers, executioners, people who handled death, blood, or impurity. Their work was necessary, but their presence was despised. Even centuries later, the stigma of these roles persisted. To be born into such a family meant a life without hope of redemption. In feudal Japan, purity and pollution were not just spiritual ideas, they defined your humanity. Honor was both a weapon and a shield. It could elevate a person to glory or destroy them overnight. Even the smallest gestures carried meaning. A samurai bowing too shallowly before his superior could be seen as insolence. A peasant speaking too boldly could invite punishment. Women, too, were bound by their own codes of modesty and obedience, their honor tied to virtue and silence. To live honorably was not a choice, it was survival. In the capital, Kyoto, where the imperial court still shimmered with traces of ancient elegance, the air itself seemed to hum with hierarchy. Courtiers moved with calculated grace, their robes trailing across polished floors, each gesture choreographed like a dance. A misplaced glance or an improper word could end a career. To the commoners who glimpsed these rarefied scenes, it was like watching a distant world made of silk and shadow, a reminder that even beauty had rules, and every step came with consequence. This rigid system gave feudal Japan its sense of order, but it also suffocated those who lived within it. There was no escaping one's place, no reinvention or mobility. The only release was death, and even then, one's honor followed into the next life. It is said that a person's spirit in Japan could not rest if their duty was unfulfilled or their name dishonored. The people lived not just for themselves, but for their ancestors, their lords, and the delicate balance that held everything together. For someone from the modern world, this unyielding structure would feel unbearable. The idea that your fate, behavior, and even emotions were dictated by your birth, would be impossible to endure. But for those who lived in feudal Japan, it was as natural as breathing. To question, it was not just rebellion, it was madness. The weight of class and honor pressed down on every heart, shaping the rhythm of life like the steady beat of a distant drum. In that world, to survive a day was to know your place and to move through it with quiet, perfect grace. If you were born a peasant in feudal Japan, your life would be tied to the soil, its blessings and its cruelty alike. From dawn to dusk, your existence revolved around the rice paddies that stretched across the valleys like mirrors to the sky. You were not a landowner, not even truly free. You belonged to the domain of your local daimyo, and every grain you grew, every fish you caught, and every drop of sake you brewed existed under his authority. Your body was your lord's property as much as the field itself, and survival meant labor without end. A peasant's day began long before the sun appeared. The morning mist clung to the flooded fields, and the air carried the scent of wet grass and wood smoke. You would eat a small bowl of millet gruel, sometimes flavored with pickled vegetables if fortune smiled, and then you would wade barefoot into the mud. The cold water reached your knees, numbing your legs as you planted rice seedlings row after row. There was no machinery to ease the burden, only your hands, your back, and the cooperation of your neighbors. Farming was communal, for no one could tend the fields alone. Together, villagers repaired levees, shared tools, and watched the skies for signs of rain or drought. Rice was not just food, it was life itself. It was currency, tax, and sustenance. Each season carried its own rhythm of toil. In the spring, the fields were flooded and planted. In summer, farmers battled weeds, pests, and heat. In autumn, the harvest was celebrated, though much of it was taken by tax collectors before the villagers could even taste it. Winter brought rest for the land, but not for the people, who repaired tools, wove straw sandals, and prayed for good weather in the coming year. The cycle never ended, and neither did the debt to one's lord. The taxes were crushing. The daimyo and his retainers claimed a large portion of every harvest, sometimes up to 2/3 of the crop. Inspectors would visit the village to measure the yield, often taking more than was fair. To protest was dangerous. A samurai enforcing the collection could cut down a farmer on the spot if he sensed defiance. Many peasants learned to bow deeply and smile, even as their families went hungry. Some hid small caches of rice in secret compartments beneath their floors, a desperate insurance against famine, though discovery meant punishment or death. Life's hardships extended beyond hunger. The villages were small and isolated, connected by dirt roads that turned to rivers of mud during the rainy season. Homes were made of wood and thatch, offering little protection from the cold or insects. In summer, mosquitoes bred in the paddies, carrying disease. In winter, bitter winds blew through the walls, and families huddled together for warmth. Firewood was scarce, and illness common. There were no doctors, only healers who relied on herbal mixtures and prayer. Childbirth was perilous, and few families escaped the pain of losing infants or loved ones to fever or malnutrition. Yet, even amid this hardship, there was community. Peasants lived not as individuals, but as parts of a living village body. Everyone knew their role, and mutual cooperation was essential. During festivals, the same people who worked shoulder to shoulder in the fields would gather to dance, sing, and share what little they had. These brief moments of joy broke the monotony of suffering and reminded them that they were not alone. The festivals honored local gods and spirits, believed to watch over the land. Offerings of sake and rice were made to ensure good harvests and protection from disasters. The boundary between the spiritual and the everyday was faint, and faith gave meaning to their endurance. Marriage among peasants was less about romance and more about survival. Families often arranged unions to strengthen labor ties or share resources. Love, if it came, grew slowly between shared hardship, laughter under the moon, and whispered dreams by the fire. Women worked as hard as men, tending fields, raising children, and managing homes. They brewed sake, spun thread, and dried fish for trade. Their days were relentless, their hands always busy. Yet, in many villages, women also held quiet authority, managing household affairs and mediating disputes when men were away. Famine was the peasants' constant fear. A single bad year could wipe out entire communities. Floods, droughts, locusts, or crop disease could turn abundance into desperation. People would boil roots, bark, or even straw to survive. In the worst of times, parents gave up food for their children, or left newborns at temples in hope of mercy. There are accounts from certain regions of the Edo period where villagers resorted to eating anything that could be chewed grass, paper, even clay. And yet, life continued. The will to endure was stronger than the hunger that consumed them. Despite the grinding poverty, peasants developed their own culture of resilience. Their songs echoed through the fields, rhythmic chants that matched the motion of planting and harvesting. Their festivals filled the air with laughter and drumming. Even their folk tales spoke of clever farmers outwitting greedy lords or spirits rewarding the humble. These stories gave them a kind of quiet rebellion, a reminder that even if the world was unjust, the heart could still be free. The relationship between peasants and samurai was complex. While samurai were their protectors in theory, most peasants only saw them during tax collection or inspections. A samurai could demand food, shelter, or supplies at any time. The peasants obeyed without question, knowing the alternative could be fatal. But there were also moments of unexpected kindness, stories of samurai sharing rice during famine or defending villages from bandits. Still, those were exceptions. The rule was obedience, and obedience was survival. If you were to live as a peasant in feudal Japan, you would know exhaustion as your closest companion. Your hands would be cracked, your skin burned from the sun, your stomach often half empty. You would live in constant awareness of your place, below the samurai, beneath the lord, at the mercy of weather and fate. But you would also find small beauty in the rhythm of it, all the way the wind rippled across the paddies, the songs that rose at dusk, the warmth of shared sake on a cold night. You would not last a day in that world unless you learned to find strength in silence. To the people of feudal Japan, endurance was not just a necessity, it was an art. The art of surviving without complaint, of finding peace in toil, and of honoring the land that both sustained and enslaved them. To understand life in feudal Japan, one must understand the samurai, not just the warriors themselves, but the immense discipline and spiritual weight they carried. The samurai were more than soldiers. They were the backbone of the entire feudal order. They were born into duty, bred for loyalty, and bound by honor so tightly that it governed every moment of their existence. For them, life was a preparation for death. To live as a samurai was to walk a razor's edge, poised between serenity and violence. The day of a samurai began in silence, just before dawn. He would wake to the sound of a wooden clapper echoing through his estate, a signal that training was about to begin. There was no lingering in bed, no indulgence in comfort. Every movement was purposeful. He would wash his face with cold water, dress in simple robes, and bow toward the rising sun. For some, the morning began with meditation seated in stillness, breathing steadily, clearing the mind of distraction. The sword was not just a weapon to them, but an extension of the spirit. To master it, the samurai had to master himself. Training was relentless. Hours were spent perfecting strikes, footwork, and posture. Every cut, every draw of the blade was practiced until it became instinct. The katana was treated with reverence, believed to contain the soul of its wielder. A single nick in its edge was a dishonor. The samurai trained with bows, spears, and horseback as well, but the sword remained the heart of their identity. Even in times of peace, when there were no wars to fight, training continued. Their purpose was not only to battle enemies, but to embody the discipline of their class. Beyond physical skill, the samurai followed a moral path known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. It demanded courage, honesty, compassion, respect, loyalty, and honor unto death. These were not abstract ideals, but practical commandments that guided daily behavior. To lie, to act selfishly, or to disobey one's lord was to destroy one's honor. And without honor, a samurai was nothing. Many were raised from childhood to believe that death in service was more desirable than life in shame. A life without purpose was a life already lost. A samurai's loyalty was absolute. His life belonged to his daimyo, his master. If his lord fell in battle or was disgraced, the samurai was expected to follow him into death. Some would commit seppuku ritual suicide, performed with a short blade plunged into the abdomen, believing it to be the only way to restore their honor or atone for failure. The act was both horrifying and sacred, carried out with calm precision. To die without fear was the highest expression of the samurai spirit. Witnesses described such scenes with awe, the air thick with incense and solemnity. Even in agony, the samurai's face was expected to remain serene, his final words composed as poetry. For all their discipline and power, samurai life was far from easy. They lived under constant surveillance of duty and expectation. Every bow, every word, every gesture reflected upon their lord. Pride had to be tempered with humility, and emotion concealed behind restraint. Many samurai lived in modest conditions, especially during long periods of peace. Their stipends were paid in rice, and the amount depended on rank. Some became poor over time, forced to sell heirlooms or take menial jobs to survive, yet still they carried themselves with the pride of warriors. To show desperation would have been dishonor. Education was another pillar of samurai life. They studied not only martial arts, but also calligraphy, poetry, history, and philosophy. A true samurai was expected to be as skilled with the brush as with the sword. Writing poetry was a form of reflection, a way to discipline the mind and maintain inner harmony. Many wrote about the transience of life, comparing fallen blossoms to the fleeting nature of existence. Beauty and death were intertwined in their worldview. To appreciate one was to understand the other. Even off the battlefield, their conduct remained bound by duty. A samurai could not simply act on emotion or personal desire. If insulted, he was expected to respond with measured dignity, unless the offense threatened his honor. Then he might challenge his foe to a duel, where skill and fate would decide who lived. Yet dueling was not reckless. There were rules, rituals, and respect even in the act of killing. Every motion, from bowing before combat to the final draw of the blade, was performed with solemn precision. Violence was never casual. It was ceremony. The burden of the samurai's path extended to his family as well. Wives were expected to be obedient, disciplined, and capable of managing the household in their husband's absence. Children were raised under the same strict codes. Sons were taught swordsmanship from a young age, while daughters learned propriety and endurance. Even within their homes, there was little room for softness. A moment of carelessness could bring shame upon generations. Some samurai families lived under so much pressure that they grew detached from emotion altogether, expressing affection through duty rather than words. And yet, beneath the iron shell of discipline, there were cracks. Many samurai struggled with the contradictions of their world. They were expected to serve lords who might be corrupt or cruel, to fight in wars that brought no glory, to die for ideals that no longer matched reality. During times of peace, when there were no enemies left to fight, some fell into boredom or despair. Others turned to art, tea ceremony, or Zen meditation to fill the void. A few abandoned their posts altogether, wandering as ronin masterless warriors seeking meaning beyond the confines of their code. But for most, there was no escape. Their duty defined them until their final breath. To live a single day as a samurai required an unshakable will. The posture had to remain upright, the gaze calm, the mind clear, no matter what weight the heart carried. Fear was forbidden, as was complaint. Every action, from the way they walked to the way they drew their sword, had to embody grace and control. It was a life of beauty and brutality intertwined, where death was always near, but never feared. For someone from the modern world, the unrelenting discipline of a samurai would feel impossible. There was no space for self-indulgence, no tolerance for weakness. To survive, one had to live every moment as though it were one's last, and to meet that end with quiet dignity. In feudal Japan, the samurai were the keepers of order, the enforcers of loyalty, and the embodiment of honor. But their world was not one of freedom. It was a life lived within the tightest bounds imaginable, a life of control, purpose, and inevitable sacrifice. In the quiet folds of feudal Japan's history, the lives of women were often written between the lines, unseen, unspoken, but vital. While the songs of the samurai and the rise of warlords filled the chronicles, the women who sustained the homes, raised the children, and upheld the unseen balance of society carried burdens that no sword could cut away. Their strength was silent, their endurance often unnoticed. Yet, without them, the world of men would have unraveled. From birth, a woman's path was shaped by her family's station. For the daughters of peasants, life meant endless labor. For the daughters of samurai, it meant discipline and expectation. For the daughters of artisans or merchants, it meant duty to trade and family name. But no matter the class, one truth bound them all: their worth was measured by obedience, chastity, and service. In a world where hierarchy ruled every breath, women lived beneath even the lowest man, their power existing in whispers and subtleties rather than commands. In a peasant village, a woman's day began before dawn. She kindled the fire, fetched water, and prepared rice gruel for her family before joining her husband in the fields. She worked in the mud with her bare hands, planting and harvesting crops, carrying baskets heavier than her frame could bear. When famine came, she often ate less so her children could survive. Her hands grew calloused, her back bent, and her dreams were buried in the soil. Yet her resilience was unmatched. Between tending to fields, she sewed clothes, repaired roofs, and cared for the elderly. Her world was one of constant motion, with no moment for rest or reflection. And still, she found joy in the smallest things: the laughter of her child, the cool touch of river water on her skin, the rare quiet of evening when the crickets sang. For women of the samurai class, life was a different kind of confinement. They lived within estates surrounded by high walls, their behavior a reflection of their husband's honor. A samurai's wife was expected to embody dignity and restraint. She managed servants, oversaw the household, and maintained the rituals that defined order. Love was rarely part of marriage. Alliances were forged through arrangement, joining families for power or status. Yet despite these constraints, samurai women were far from passive. Many were trained in naginata, the long-bladed polearm designed to defend the home while men were at war. They were taught to be composed, courageous, and prepared for sacrifice. In times of siege, women guarded the gates, tended the wounded, and sometimes chose death over capture, believing it more honorable to die with dignity than live in shame. There were women who stood as quiet symbols of courage. Tales were told of wives who encouraged their husbands to face death bravely, or who took up weapons themselves when duty demanded it. Some served as strategists and messengers, hidden behind veils of obedience. And though the law often silenced them, their loyalty and cunning shaped the destinies of their clans. In letters written in delicate brushstrokes, their words carried both tenderness and steel. A woman might address her husband with humility, but between the lines, her resolve burned clear. In urban centers like Kyoto and Edo, merchant and artisan women lived with different pressures. Their husbands worked long hours in workshops or traveled for trade, leaving them to manage businesses, negotiate deals, and maintain order at home. Officially, they had no authority. In practice, many became the true backbone of their families' livelihoods. They balanced ledgers, directed apprentices, and ensured debts were paid, all while raising children and keeping their homes in harmony. Yet society rarely acknowledged their labor. They were expected to smile and bow, their accomplishments folded neatly beneath their husbands' names. For women of higher birth, the wives and daughters of daimyo life was gilded but suffocating. They lived surrounded by beauty, silk screens painted with cranes, tatami floors polished to perfection, and gardens arranged with symbolic care. Yet their lives were bound by ceremony. Every movement, every word was rehearsed. They dressed in layers of fine silk that weighed heavy on their shoulders, attended endless rituals, and were guarded by attendants day and night. Their marriages were tools of politics, and their emotions were luxuries they could not afford. Some became masters of poetry or calligraphy, expressing their inner lives through fleeting verses about the moon or the falling petals of a cherry tree. In those verses, one can still hear their longing for freedom, hidden beneath elegance. There were also women who lived beyond these boundaries, the entertainers, poets, and courtesans of the pleasure quarters. While many saw them as sinful or shameful, some of these women were among the most educated and eloquent of their time. The Oiran high-ranking courtesans studied literature, art, and conversation. They could recite poetry, play instruments, and engage with nobles as intellectual equals. Yet behind the beauty and performance was a harsh reality of control. Their lives were sold, their fates dictated by contracts and patrons. Still, through their art, they carved spaces of identity in a world that denied them autonomy. They became living embodiments of impermanence, admired yet forgotten, adorned yet unseen. Motherhood carried both tenderness and terror. Childbirth was dangerous, with little medical aid beyond herbal remedies and prayers. Many women did not survive it. Their lives offered to continue the family line. Those who did lived for their children, teaching them humility, endurance, and respect. A mother's guidance shaped future warriors, monks, and artisans. Yet her sacrifices were seldom remembered in official records. History preserved the names of the men who led armies or wrote decrees, but not the women who raised them to do so. In the spiritual world, women sought solace in faith. Temples and shrines offered rare sanctuaries where they could pray for mercy or strength. Some became Buddhist nuns, renouncing worldly life to seek enlightenment. These women shaved their heads, wore plain robes, and lived in quiet devotion. For many, it was the only path to freedom, a release from the endless cycles of duty and expectation. In the silence of temple halls, they found dignity and simplicity, away from the gaze of men. If you were to live a day as a woman in feudal Japan, you would move carefully, every gesture measured. Your speech would be soft, your posture straight, your emotions hidden behind a calm mask. You would know that the wrong word could bring disgrace, that your happiness was not your own to decide. And yet, within those limitations, you would find a quiet power, the ability to shape the world through patience, to endure without breaking, to love without hope of reward. The women of feudal Japan did not fight battles with swords, but with silence, intelligence, and endurance. Their lives were the steady heartbeat beneath the noise of history. And though time may have buried their names, their strength still echoes through the centuries in every story of survival, in every whispered prayer that drifted into the dawn. To live in feudal Japan was to live beneath the shadow of power, and that power took form in the figure of the daimyo. These lords were the rulers of their domains, commanders of armies, collectors of taxes, and enforcers of loyalty. Each daimyo governed his land like a small kingdom, with absolute authority over everyone within his borders. For those who lived under his rule, his presence was both distant and immediate, like a mountain immovable, immense, and impossible to ignore. The daimyo were men of great ambition, their lives woven into the web of politics and war. Their castles stood on high ground, surrounded by moats and stone walls that symbolized strength and prestige. From these fortresses, they controlled everything: grain harvests, trade routes, temple donations, and the movements of their samurai. Their banners bore unique crests, fluttering proudly in the wind, reminders that all who toiled below did so for the glory of their lord. A daimyo's will was law, and his mood could shape the fate of thousands. For the common people, the daimyo was a figure of awe and fear. Most peasants would never see their lord in person, yet his influence touched every part of their existence. The rice they grew, the taxes they paid, even the festivals they celebrated, all were dictated by his decrees. His soldiers rode through the villages in armor that gleamed like mirrors, their swords glinting in the sun. When the daimyo passed through on procession, the peasants were required to kneel, heads bowed to the dirt, forbidden from even looking upon his face. The sight of his retinue, a line of samurai, attendants, and banners, was both beautiful and terrifying, a living symbol of hierarchy and power. Within his castle walls, life was equally bound by ceremony. Servants moved with practiced precision, speaking only when spoken to. Samurai retainers guarded every gate, their loyalty tested daily. The daimyo himself rose early, his mornings often spent in council with advisors and scribes who read out reports from across the domain. Every decision, from the distribution of rice to the appointment of officials, required careful balance. To govern poorly was to invite rebellion. To govern harshly was to breed resentment. Yet mercy could be seen as weakness. A daimyo had to embody strength and control, for in feudal Japan, power was both fragile and absolute. Beneath the daimyo's rule, the samurai lived as both protectors and instruments of authority. They enforced his will in distant villages, ensured taxes were collected, and kept peace through fear and order. Their loyalty was rewarded with stipends of rice and land, but their freedom was limited. They were bound by the same web of duty that held the peasants in place, though gilded with prestige. The daimyo could summon them at any time, demanding service, war, or death. And in turn, they offered their lives without question. To hesitate was treason. Life within the castle was a study in contrasts. The grand halls were adorned with screens painted in gold and silk, the scent of incense drifting through the air. Musicians played gentle melodies on koto and shamisen during evening gatherings, while servants poured sake into lacquer cups. Yet beneath the elegance, there was constant tension. Alliances shifted like the seasons. Daimyo were bound to the shogun through fragile loyalty, and many harbored secret ambitions to expand their power. A single whisper of betrayal could end a family's legacy overnight. Intrigue and suspicion filled the air, as sharp as any sword. The daimyo's wife lived within these walls like a caged bird of silk and restraint. She oversaw the inner household, managing attendants, overseeing meals, and organizing ceremonies. Her life was measured in rituals and appearances, her influence subtle but real. In some domains, she played a key role in maintaining peace, serving as mediator between rival retainers or families. Her grace reflected her husband's honor, and her discretion could mean the difference between stability and scandal. Many bore the loneliness of arranged marriage with quiet dignity, their voices unheard beyond the sliding doors of the inner chambers. For the peasants outside those walls, the daimyo's rule was both protector and oppressor. His armies defended them from bandits and invaders, but his taxes drained their labor to the brink of ruin. When war came, their sons were conscripted to serve as porters, builders, or cannon fodder. The daimyo's ambition could mean the destruction of their homes, yet their survival depended on his victory. They prayed for his strength, even as they cursed their own hunger. The villagers' loyalty was not born of love, but of fear and necessity, a quiet devotion carved by generations of obedience. In times of peace, the daimyo's focus turned to refinement. They sponsored temples, schools, and the arts, seeking to display their sophistication and piety. They hosted tea ceremonies that blended elegance with philosophy, studied calligraphy, and composed poetry. The ideal lord was not only strong but cultured, embodying harmony between war and wisdom. Yet behind every poem lay the shadow of power, every gentle brushstroke hiding the hand that once commanded armies. Even peace was a form of control, a display of dominance through order. The power of the daimyo reached beyond life. When one died, his funeral was an elaborate display of loyalty and grief. Priests chanted sutras as the air filled with incense, and retainers wept as though their souls were bound to their masters. Some committed seppuku to follow him into death, a final act of fidelity. The people watched from afar, their emotions a mixture of sorrow and relief. The cycle would begin again, with a new lord to serve, a new name to bow to. For those who lived under the daimyo's shadow, survival meant understanding the balance of power. You bowed deeply when ordered, paid your taxes on time, and never spoke out of turn. You watched the horizon carefully, for the banners of war could rise at any moment. Your loyalty was your armor, your silence your shield. And even when the daimyo's castle gleamed like a jewel above the valley, you knew it cast a long shadow one that reached every home, every field, and every heart. To live a single day beneath that shadow was to feel the constant pressure of unseen eyes, the weight of rules that could not be questioned. In feudal Japan, power flowed downward like water, and everyone beneath the daimyo's gaze learned to bow before it or be swept away. High above the valleys where peasants toiled and lords ruled, the mountains of Japan stood in silent majesty. Shrouded in mist and mystery, they were the homes of monks, hermits, and wanderers who had turned away from the chaos of the world below. These mountains were not just landscapes, they were sacred realms, places where the human and the divine met in quiet whispers carried by the wind. To live among them was to surrender comfort, to abandon wealth and power, and to seek peace through hardship. But in feudal Japan, even the pursuit of enlightenment came with its own burdens. Monks in feudal Japan lived lives of discipline and simplicity. Their days began before sunrise with the deep toll of a temple bell echoing through the forest. They rose from thin straw mats, their robes worn and rough against the skin, and moved in silence toward the main hall. The air was cool and damp, scented with cedar and incense. With slow, rhythmic chants, they recited sutras, their voices blending into a low hum that seemed to dissolve into the mountains themselves. Meditation followed long hours seated in stillness, legs crossed, back straight, minds emptying like streams, feeding into the sea of nothingness. The life of a monk demanded complete renunciation. They owned no possessions beyond their robes, a begging bowl, and prayer beads. Their food came from the alms of nearby villages, offered by farmers who saw them as holy men, bridging the mortal and spiritual worlds. Some monasteries cultivated small gardens or tended orchards, living from what nature provided. Meals were simple rice, pickled vegetables, tofu, and tea. Meat was forbidden, not just by doctrine, but by compassion. Life, in all its forms, was sacred, and even the smallest insect might be spared. Yet not all monks lived in peace. Some temples were centers of power, commanding armies of warrior monks, known as sohei. These men, trained in both prayer and battle, protected their temples from rival sects or political threats. They wielded naginata and bows, fought on horseback, and marched under banners bearing Buddhist symbols. The contrast between their spiritual devotion and their violent purpose reflected the complexity of religion in feudal Japan. Temples were sanctuaries, but they were also political forces, owning vast tracts of land and influencing lords and peasants alike. For those who sought solitude rather than structure, the mountains offered a different path. These were the Yamabushi, the mountain ascetics, who lived apart from both temple and village. Clad in rough robes and conical hats, they wandered through forests, slept in caves, and trained their bodies and spirits in secret rituals. Their practices were a blend of Buddhism, Shinto, and ancient folk belief. They meditated beneath icy waterfalls, walked barefoot through snow, and fasted for days to purge the body and awaken the soul. Their goal was enlightenment through endurance, a harmony between man and nature that transcended ordinary life. To meet one of these hermits was considered a moment of destiny. To live as one required strength beyond the physical, a surrender to the eternal rhythm of the world. Temples dotted the landscape of feudal Japan, from grand complexes in Kyoto to hidden shrines deep in the woods. Each had its own character. Some were places of study, where monks transcribed sacred texts by candlelight, the sound of brushes scratching against parchment echoing softly through the halls. Others were centers of pilgrimage, where weary travelers climbed long stone steps to seek blessings for health or fortune. Pilgrims came carrying offerings, coins, incense, or simple prayers written on wooden tablets called ima. In those spaces, rich and poor stood side by side, united in humility before the divine. Despite their separation from worldly life, monks were deeply intertwined with the people. They presided over funerals, blessed newborns, and offered guidance in times of famine or war. During plague outbreaks, they burned incense and chanted sutras to ward off evil spirits. When natural disasters struck, they opened their temples as refuge for the homeless. Their influence extended even to the lords, who often sought spiritual counsel before battle or built temples to ensure divine favor. Religion was not just faith, it was an essential thread in the fabric of feudal society. But the path of a monk was not always pure or peaceful. Corruption and ambition found their way even into temples. Some abbots grew rich through land ownership, hoarding donations meant for the poor. Monks could be drawn into political schemes, forming alliances with daimyo or shoguns. Battles between rival sects were not uncommon, and entire monasteries could be burned in struggles for influence. The sacred and the worldly were never fully separate, and the line between prayer and power often blurred beneath the temple eaves. For women who sought the monastic life, the path was even harder. Nuns lived in isolation, their temples smaller and poorer than those of men. Yet their devotion was no less profound. Many came from noble families, seeking escape from marriage or grief. They shaved their heads, donned plain robes, and dedicated themselves to prayer and teaching. In silence and simplicity, they found a measure of freedom denied to them in the world outside. Their chants carried across the fields like gentle waves, unseen but enduring. The mystics of the mountains lived closer to the edge of the unseen world than anyone else. Legends told of Yamabushi, who could summon storms, heal the sick, or commune with spirits. Villagers brought offerings to them, fearing both their blessings and their curses. Whether truth or myth, these stories reflected a deep respect for those who lived in harmony with the forces of nature. In a time when life was uncertain and death ever near, the mountains represented both danger and salvation, a reminder that something greater than human ambition governed the world. If you were to spend a day in the life of a monk in feudal Japan, you would know stillness and struggle in equal measure. The chill of the morning air would bite at your skin as you sat in meditation, every muscle aching from stillness. You would eat slowly, mindful of every bite, and speak little, for words were precious and silence was sacred. You would walk through cedar forests where sunlight filtered like liquid gold through the leaves, and feel the presence of eternity in every breath. And yet, you would also feel the ache of hunger, the sting of discipline, the solitude that pressed like a weight upon the soul. To live as a monk or mystic in feudal Japan was to walk the border between worlds, the worldly and the divine, the body and the spirit, the fleeting and the eternal. It was a path few could endure, but those who did carried with them a peace untouched by power or fear. In their quiet devotion, they reflected a truth that echoed through all of Japan, that even in a world ruled by war and hierarchy, the deepest strength was found in stillness. If you were to wake in feudal Japan with a fever, a cough, or a festering wound, your chances of survival would depend more on luck and superstition than on medicine. This was a world where science was intertwined with spirit, where illness was as much a moral and spiritual condition as it was physical. The people of the time lived in close harmony with nature, but nature was unforgiving, and disease was an ever-present shadow. Even the strong and the disciplined could fall in an instant to ailments that had no cure. Cleanliness in feudal Japan held a spiritual dimension. To wash one's hands, to bathe, or to cleanse a room was not merely for hygiene, but for purity. The concept of kigari spiritual pollution guided much of daily life. Contact with blood, death, or decay was believed to taint the body and soul. Bathing was both a physical and spiritual act, restoring balance and purity. Public baths existed in towns and villages, where people washed together in hot spring water or wooden tubs. The steam rose into the air, mixing with the scent of pine and smoke. For peasants, this might be a rare luxury, but even the poorest would wash in rivers or streams whenever possible. Cleanliness, though deeply valued, could not protect them from invisible diseases that spread silently through their communities. The most common illnesses were those born of hardship, malnutrition, infection, and exhaustion. Villages suffered frequent outbreaks of smallpox, cholera, and influenza. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and no real understanding of contagion. When sickness spread, people often turned to faith. Temples would hold ceremonies to appease angry spirits believed to cause disease. Families would hang charms or amulets over doorways, hoping to keep evil forces away. Incense was burned, prayers chanted, and offerings made to the gods of health and healing. Some believed that disease was punishment for breaking social order or neglecting ritual. The spiritual and the physical were inseparable, and healing was as much a matter of belief as of treatment. For those who practiced medicine, knowledge was limited but growing. Traditional Japanese medicine Kambo had its roots in Chinese herbalism and philosophy. Healers believed that the body contained vital energies and that illness arose when these energies fell out of balance. Treatment involved restoring harmony through herbs, diet, and acupuncture. Remedies were made from roots, barks, leaves, and minerals. Ginseng for strength, ginger for the stomach, mugwort for purification, and green tea for vitality. The preparation of medicines was meticulous, a blend of science and art. Monks often served as physicians, tending to the sick with patience and compassion, recording their treatments in scrolls illuminated by candlelight. Surgery, however, was rare and feared. A body was sacred, and cutting into it was considered dangerous to both the soul and the spirit. When wounds were deep or infected, healers used poultices made from herbs, or seared the flesh with heated metal to stop bleeding. There was no anesthesia beyond sake or the endurance of pain. Soldiers and peasants alike bore scars that never fully healed, reminders of the limits of medicine. For infections, the best hope was prayer, and for many, death was seen as an inevitable part of life rather than a failure of healing. In cities like Kyoto and Edo, where populations were dense, disease spread quickly. Streets were narrow, and sanitation was primitive. Waste was collected in buckets and used as fertilizer in fields, a practical but dangerous practice that spread parasites and illness. Yet compared to medieval Europe, Japan's sense of cleanliness gave it an advantage. Daily washing, removal of shoes indoors, and the cultural aversion to filth helped reduce some sickness. Still, epidemics swept through the islands in waves, leaving grief in every village and temple. Graves were dug hurriedly, incense burned through the night, and bells tolled endlessly as monks prayed for the departed. Among the samurai class, physicians held a position of respect, though their treatments were still limited. Some samurai practiced Kempo themselves, studying herbs and anatomy as part of their education. In larger domains, doctors served under the daimyo, maintaining the health of his family and retainers. They recorded case studies, experimented with new combinations of herbs, and sometimes corresponded with scholars from China or Korea to exchange knowledge. Yet even the most skilled doctor could do little against diseases like tuberculosis or plague. A fever could sweep through a castle and strike both lord and servant alike. Death ignored rank. The Japanese understanding of disease was also deeply tied to nature's balance. Illness could be caused, they believed, by the corruption of air or water, by spirits residing in unclean places, or by emotional imbalance. Fear, anger, or grief could weaken the spirit, making the body vulnerable. Healing, therefore, was as much about restoring calm as curing symptoms. The tea ceremony, meditation, and poetry were sometimes prescribed as treatments for the soul. A calm mind was a healthy mind, and harmony within could restore harmony without. When death came, and it came often, it was accepted with a kind of grace. Funerals were solemn but orderly, guided by Buddhist ritual. The dead were washed and dressed, incense burned to purify the space, and prayers offered for the spirit's journey. Families wore plain robes of mourning and avoided joyous activities for weeks or months. Though grief was heavy, there was also a quiet acceptance of impermanence, a belief that death was simply another form of transformation. The phrase mano, no aware, the gentle sadness of life's impermanence, shaped how people faced both illness and mortality. In times of great plague, entire villages could vanish. Travelers would speak of abandoned homes, of rice paddies left untended, of silence where laughter once was. Yet life always returned. New families would rebuild, plant fresh seeds, and restore what was lost. In Japan's long history, suffering and renewal walked hand in hand. If you were to live a day in feudal Japan, you would carry the fear of sickness like a constant companion. A small cut could become a death sentence. A cough could take a family within weeks. You would wash your hands in cold river water and whisper a prayer to the gods of health, hoping they listened. The scent of incense and herbs would fill your home, a fragile defense against what could not be seen. And if sickness came, you would sit by the fire, listening to the soft rhythm of chanting from a nearby temple, knowing that whether you lived or died, your fate was part of the endless cycle that bound all living things. To live in that world was to live at the mercy of both nature and spirit, to endure, to adapt, and to find peace even in the shadow of disease. In feudal Japan, the body was frail, but the soul learned to be strong. In feudal Japan, eating was never taken for granted. Each meal, no matter how humble, was a reflection of survival, season, and social order. For the peasants who worked the land, food was the reward of endless toil. For the samurai, it was a ritual of restraint and simplicity. And for the nobles, it was a quiet performance of refinement and power. But whether one dined in a castle or a straw-roofed hut, food was more than nourishment. It was a mirror of the fragile balance that sustained life in a world of scarcity and hierarchy. For most people, daily sustenance revolved around rice. But rice was not always plentiful, and not everyone could afford to eat it in abundance. The peasants who grew it often could not keep much for themselves, as large portions of the harvest went to taxes and tribute. Many survived instead on barley, millet, or buckwheat, grains that filled the stomach but lacked the prestige of polished white rice. The rice that did remain for their own use was often mixed with husks or diluted with other grains to make it last longer. To eat pure white rice was a rare luxury, something reserved for festivals or the upper classes. A typical peasant meal was simple and repetitive. In the morning, there might be a bowl of millet porridge, eaten quickly before heading to the fields. At midday, perhaps boiled vegetables, daikon radish, burdock root, or wild greens gathered from the mountainside. In the evening, miso soup flavored with fermented bean paste, and maybe, on good days, a small piece of fish or tofu. Salt was precious and used sparingly. Sweetness was almost unknown, except in the form of rare fruits or honey found in the wild. Meat from animals like cows or pigs was largely forbidden, both by Buddhist custom and by the laws of the shogunate. To kill and eat such creatures was considered impure, though fish and fowl were acceptable. In truth, however, necessity often outweighed law, and hungry families would eat whatever they could find when times were hard. Seasonality shaped every bite. Spring brought tender greens and bamboo shoots, while summer offered cucumbers, eggplant, and river fish. Autumn was the season of harvest, when rice, mushrooms, and chestnuts filled the villages with their earthy scent. Winter was harshest of all, when food had to be preserved through drying, salting, or pickling. Barrels of miso and soy sauce were stored carefully to last through the cold months, and families gathered around the hearth to share hot soups that warmed both body and spirit. Every season carried its own flavor, and people learned to eat in rhythm with the earth, taking only what nature allowed. The samurai diet, though more privileged, reflected discipline and restraint. They valued simplicity, believing indulgence dulled the mind and body. Meals were modest, served in small lacquered bowls arranged with precision. A bowl of rice, a bowl of miso soup, a few pickled vegetables, and perhaps grilled fish or tofu. Tea accompanied most meals, its bitterness sharpening focus. Even in moments of peace, samurai approached eating as an act of mindfulness. To waste food was dishonor. To overeat was weakness. Their meals reminded them that control was the path to strength. In contrast, the kitchens of the daimyo and court nobles were worlds of refinement. Meals were prepared by skilled cooks who treated cooking as an art. Dishes were arranged not only for taste, but for beauty, each element symbolizing nature's harmony. A sprig of pine might represent longevity, a piece of red pickled plum, the warmth of life. The ingredients were chosen for color and balance, greens for renewal, whites for purity, reds for vitality. Eating was as much a ceremony as the tea ritual itself. Yet even the nobility lived within limits. Extravagance was frowned upon, and displays of excess could invite envy or suspicion. True elegance lay in subtlety, not abundance. In the bustling castle towns, merchants and travelers found sustenance in small food stalls that lined the streets. Vendors sold grilled skewers of eel or tofu, bowls of steaming soba noodles, and rice balls wrapped in seaweed for those in a hurry. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, soy sauce, and roasted grains. These early street foods offered comfort to the working class, a small pleasure in a life filled with duty. But even these meals were humble, compared to what the wealthy could enjoy. For those who lived in poverty, hunger was a constant shadow. During years of poor harvest, entire villages faced starvation. People boiled tree bark, chewed on roots, and made soup from wild grasses to survive. There are stories of mothers giving their portion to their children, of old men retreating into the mountains so the young might live. The human body could endure much, but hunger stripped away strength and hope. In those times, even the ritual of a meal became sacred, a moment of gratitude for what little remained. Sake, the rice wine of Japan, was a rare indulgence for the poor, but a necessity for the elite. Brewed from fermented rice, it played a role in both celebration and ceremony. Samurai drank it during victories or rituals of loyalty. Peasants brewed small batches for festivals and marriages. Its warmth soothed the body after long labor, and its intoxication provided brief escape from hardship. To share sake was to share trust, and to drink it alone was to confront the silence of one's thoughts. Etiquette governed every aspect of dining. One did not begin eating until everyone was served, and meals began with the phrase "itadakimasu," a humble acknowledgement of gratitude to those who prepared the food and to the life taken to sustain one's own. Chopsticks were handled with care, never stuck upright in a bowl, for that gesture resembled funeral rites. Silence was often kept during meals, broken only by the sound of tea being poured or soup being sipped. To eat was an act of awareness, a moment to honor life's impermanence. If you were to live a day in feudal Japan, you would quickly realize that food was not guaranteed. Every grain of rice would feel precious between your fingers. The smell of miso soup would carry both comfort and longing. You would eat slowly, mindful of each bite, knowing how many hands and how much suffering brought it to your bowl. The act of eating would not just fill your stomach, it would remind you of the delicate chain that connected all life, from the farmer in the field to the gods watching from the clouds. To eat in feudal Japan was to survive with gratitude. Every meal, no matter how plain, was a prayer. Every bite a lesson in humility. And for most, the quiet act of eating was not about indulgence, but endurance, a daily reminder that life itself was fragile, fleeting, and deeply sacred. Beneath the grandeur of castles and the toil of rice fields lived a quieter world, the world of artisans and merchants. These were the makers, the builders, and the traders who shaped the rhythm of daily life in feudal Japan. Their hands crafted the tools, garments, homes, and treasures that defined the nation's culture. Yet despite their essential roles, they stood low on the social ladder, regarded with suspicion or disdain by those who claimed honor through land or the sword. To live as an artisan or merchant was to balance dignity and humility, skill and survival, within the confines of a rigid hierarchy. Artisans were the heart of Japan's craftsmanship. In small workshops lined with wooden beams and the scent of sawdust and lacquer, they devoted their lives to perfection. Every stroke of a brush, every strike of a hammer, carried generations of tradition. Potters shaped clay with calloused fingers, spinning wheels that hummed softly through the day. Carpenters carved temples and homes with such precision that their joints held together for centuries without a single nail. Swordsmiths worked in fire-lit forges, folding steel again and again until it sang with strength and balance. Their work was more than labor, it was devotion. Each craft held spiritual meaning, a reflection of harmony between man, material, and nature. Yet mastery came at a price. The apprentice system was strict and unforgiving. Young boys began training as early as 7, living under the roof of a master, often without pay for years. They swept floors, prepared tools, and observed in silence until their skills were deemed worthy. Only after long endurance could they create work of their own. The apprenticeship was as much about shaping character as skill teaching patience, humility, and discipline. Failure was not measured by mistakes, but by the loss of focus or respect. To learn a craft was to dedicate one's life to it completely. Artisans rarely grew rich, but their pride lay in their precision. Their names were seldom recorded, yet their creations became timeless. The curved edge of a sword, the delicate grain of a wooden box, the perfect glaze of a tea bowl, all bore the unseen touch of hands that labored in anonymity. In a society where the samurai's sword embodied honor, it was the blacksmith who gave that honor form. Yet, paradoxically, that same craftsman was ranked far below the warrior he served. The artisan's reward was not wealth or prestige, but quiet mastery and the respect of those who understood beauty. Merchants, meanwhile, lived in a different sort of tension. They dealt not in creation, but in exchange buying and selling goods across towns, villages, and provinces. Rice, silk, tea, salt, and sake flowed through their networks like lifeblood through veins. Yet the samurai class looked down upon them, viewing trade as a pursuit of greed. In the Confucian order, merchants occupied the lowest rank of the social hierarchy, considered unproductive because they profited from the labor of others. And still, over time, many of them became quietly powerful. The merchants' homes lined the narrow streets of castle towns, their wooden facades simple and discreet. Behind those walls, storerooms overflowed with goods, and hidden accounts recorded fortunes measured in rice and coin. Outwardly, they lived modestly, wearing plain garments and bowing humbly to officials. But within, they were shrewd and organized. They formed guilds that regulated trade, set prices, and protected members' interests. Some merchants lent money to struggling samurai, binding warriors of honor to debts they could never repay. It was an unspoken irony. Those considered lowliest in society often held the true power of economy in their hands. Despite their success, merchants lived under constant restraint. The shogunate imposed strict regulations on commerce, fearing that wealth might lead to rebellion or corruption. Luxuries were restricted, prices controlled, and displays of wealth forbidden. A merchant could own a mansion and still be forced to wear rough fabrics and eat simple meals. Yet ingenuity thrived within these limits. They found ways to invest discreetly through art, land, or influence. Wealth flowed unseen, like an underground river nourishing the roots of society. Life for artisans and merchants was filled with quiet rhythm. Streets buzzed with the sounds of trade, the ringing of hammers, the chatter of bargaining, the creak of carts loaded with goods. Lanterns swayed in evening light as families closed their shops, sweeping the wooden floors clean before bowing toward small household shrines. Meals were simple, laughter subdued, but there was a dignity in their constancy. Children grew up among the tools of their parents' trade, inheriting the same calluses, the same habits, and the same dreams of modest prosperity. The merchant towns were not just centers of commerce, they were the cultural hearts of Japan. Theater, literature, and art flourished there, supported by merchant patronage. Kabuki actors performed for packed audiences. Ukiyo-e artists carved woodblocks that captured the beauty and fleeting pleasures of urban life. Though merchants could not wield swords or claim noble titles, they shaped Japan's identity through the culture they nurtured. Their wealth quietly funded temples, festivals, and education, weaving art into the daily lives of common people. Still, there was always a boundary they could not cross. No matter how rich or respected, an artisan or merchant could never become samurai. Birth was destiny, and ambition had limits. Families learned to move carefully within those lines, maintaining humility while seizing every opportunity that arose. Pride was worn not on the face, but in the hands and the grain of polished wood, the weight of fine silk, the balance of a crafted blade. If you lived a day in their world, you would rise to the sound of tools clinking and merchants calling, the scent of cedar and iron in the air. You would watch as craftsmen bowed before their work, every motion deliberate and reverent. You would see merchants counting coins by candlelight, their faces calm, their eyes sharp. And you would feel the quiet pulse of a society that thrived not through war or conquest, but through skill, patience, and trade. The artisans and merchants of feudal Japan lived without glory, but with grace. Their struggle was not to conquer, but to endure, to find meaning in the act of creation and the balance of exchange. They were the silent builders of a civilization that prized beauty in simplicity and discipline in every gesture. Though the samurai held power and the peasants tilled the land, it was these quiet workers who gave Japan its enduring soul. Justice in feudal Japan was not blind, nor was it merciful. It was a mirror of the age hierarchical, unforgiving, and shaped entirely by one's place in the social order. The idea of fairness, as we know it today, did not exist. What mattered was obedience to authority and preservation of order. To disobey your lord, to disrupt harmony, or to bring shame upon your family could mean a punishment so severe that even death seemed merciful by comparison. To survive under such a system, you had to move through life with care, every word measured, every action deliberate, for the law was not written in ink, it was written in fear. The foundation of justice rested on loyalty and social duty. The samurai class acted as both enforcers and judges. Their swords were symbols of law, and their authority came from the daimyo and ultimately the shogun. There was no separate police force, no juries, and rarely a trial. A samurai could mete out punishment on the spot if he believed honor or order demanded it. For the common people, this meant that justice was as unpredictable as the weather, sometimes lenient, sometimes cruel, always final. Punishments varied by class. For the elite, dishonor could be met with the grim ceremony of seppuku ritual suicide. A samurai who failed his duty or disobeyed orders might be granted this privilege to die by his own hand rather than face public execution. It was seen as an act of courage and redemption. The condemned would dress in white robes, kneel on a straw mat, and plunge a short blade into his abdomen, cutting across and upward. A second trusted warrior, the kaishakunin, stood by to deliver the final stroke, severing the head swiftly to end the pain. It was brutal, yet deeply ritualized, a mixture of horror and honor that defined the samurai way. Even death in this world demanded discipline. For peasants, artisans, and merchants, punishment was harsher and devoid of ceremony. The lowest classes were treated as expendable tools of the system. Theft, rebellion, or even speaking out against authority could result in torture, mutilation, or execution. There were few rights to defend oneself, and confessions were often extracted through pain. Torture was not hidden, it was spectacle. Prisoners were beaten, burned, or suspended by ropes until they yielded. The act of suffering itself was thought to cleanse guilt and restore cosmic balance. Innocence mattered little. Submission was the only path to mercy. Executions were public and deliberate. Beheadings were the most common, though crucifixion, burning, and even boiling were used for the gravest crimes. Criminals were displayed in town squares, their bodies left to rot as warnings to others. Heads of rebels or traitors were sometimes placed on pikes outside castle gates, a silent reminder of the consequences of defiance. The sight was gruesome, but effective. Fear was the glue that held society together, and the shogunate ensured that no one forgot it. The Edo period, though known for relative peace, was also known for rigid control. The Tokugawa shogunate established an intricate system of laws that governed every aspect of life, from what clothes you could wear to where you could travel. Samurai had the right to cut down commoners who disrespected them, a practice called kirisute gomen. Though it was regulated in theory, it was often abused in practice. A peasant who failed to bow deeply enough or accidentally brushed against a warrior's sleeve could be struck dead in the street. The only expectation was that the samurai report the incident afterward. Justice was not about fairness, it was about preserving hierarchy. Still, not all enforcement was cruel for cruelty's sake. Local magistrates, or bogyo, often served as administrators of justice within towns and provinces. They handled disputes over land, taxes, and trade. Some were known for fairness, others for corruption. The bureaucracy of the shogunate required endless records, petitions, and written confessions. For the literate few, words became weapons-paper appeals to distant officials who might never read them. For the illiterate masses, justice was beyond reach. Their fate lay in the hands of men they could neither question nor understand. Within villages, justice was communal. Small disputes were settled by elders or headmen, who acted as mediators rather than judges. Harmony was valued above punishment, and confessions were often sought to restore balance rather than assign blame. But when crimes drew the attention of higher authorities, the outcome was rarely gentle. Villages were held collectively responsible for crimes committed within their boundaries. If one man stole from a traveling merchant, his entire family, or even the entire village, could suffer. A burden of maintaining order fell on everyone, turning neighbor against neighbor in quiet vigilance. Women faced a different kind of justice. They were bound by moral codes that demanded chastity, obedience, and loyalty above all else. A wife accused of infidelity could be cast out, beaten, or even executed by her husband. A woman of the samurai class who brought dishonor upon her family might be ordered to take her own life, just as men did. For women of lower birth, their fate depended on the will of men around them. Law protected them little. Their voices were seldom heard, their innocence rarely proven. Yet even in silence, some found resilience navigating the system with intelligence, manipulation, and quiet endurance. For those of the outcast classes, the law was almost non-existent. The burakumin, who handled death, slaughter, and leatherwork, were considered impure and excluded from protection. They lived on the outskirts of towns, punished for crimes more harshly than others, and often accused unjustly. Even if they were innocent, few would speak for them. To be born into impurity was to live outside the reach of mercy. Prisons were bleak, designed less for reform than for suffering. They were dark wooden buildings with barred windows and straw floors crawling with vermin. Prisoners were chained together, left to starve, or forced to labor under guards' watch. Disease spread quickly, and few survived long sentences. Death was not always the punishment, but it was often the result. And yet, within this system, there existed a paradox. Justice in feudal Japan was meant to uphold not cruelty, but harmony. Punishment was seen as a way to cleanse society of disorder, to restore the balance that kept heaven and earth aligned. The people accepted this because they saw life as transient, suffering as inevitable, and obedience as sacred. To question the law was to question the order of the universe itself. If you lived a single day under this system, you would move with caution. You would bow a little deeper, speak a little softer, and avoid the eyes of authority. You would know that a careless act, a misunderstood word, or an unlucky moment could change your fate forever. Justice in feudal Japan was not a promise, it was a warning. And survival meant living within its shadow, understanding that mercy was rare and silence was safety. In that world, justice did not serve the people, it served the order. And to endure it, one had to learn the art of submission, to bend like bamboo in the storm, and to pray that when judgment came, it passed by quietly. Among all the symbols of feudal Japan, none was as sacred, feared, or revered as the sword. It was more than a weapon. It was the soul of the samurai, the embodiment of discipline, honor, and death. To live by the sword was to live by an unyielding code, one that demanded perfection in both skill and spirit. The blade represented purity, clarity, and balance, and to wield it required not just strength of body, but mastery of the mind. In feudal Japan, a man's sword was his life, and losing it was worse than losing breath itself. The forging of a sword was an act of devotion. Deep in the workshops of swordsmiths, fire glowed through the night, illuminating faces streaked with soot and sweat. The master smith worked in silence, guided by rhythm and ritual. He folded the steel over and over again, sometimes hundreds of times, hammering away impurities, shaping it into something both beautiful and deadly. The process was spiritual as much as technical. The smith would pray before his forge, cleansing himself in water before touching the steel, believing that his spirit must be pure to create a weapon worthy of a warrior. Each strike of the hammer was deliberate, echoing like a chant. When the blade was complete, it gleamed with a rippling pattern along its edge, known as the hamon, a signature of craftsmanship and soul. To receive such a sword was a sacred honor. Samurai treated their blades with reverence, naming them as though they were living beings. The sword was not merely a possession, it was an extension of one's spirit. When carried at the waist, it symbolized readiness and restraint. When drawn, it spoke of purpose and finality. The act of unsheathing a sword without reason was an insult to its spirit. To stain it with unjust blood was to tarnish one's own soul. Even when not in use, a samurai would polish his blade, whispering words of respect, ensuring it never dulled, never rusted, never forgot its purpose. Training in swordsmanship was a lifelong pursuit. From dawn until dusk, young warriors practiced their strikes and stances beneath the guidance of masters. The art of kenjutsu, the technique of the sword, was taught alongside lessons in philosophy and meditation. Each cut, each movement, was precise and controlled, designed to align body, mind, and intent. A single mistake could mean death in real combat. Yet mastery was not measured by killing, but by restraint. The greatest swordsmen were those who could end a fight without drawing their blade. Schools of swordsmanship flourished across Japan, each with its own teachings. Some emphasized speed and aggression, others patience and timing. The philosophy of the sword went far beyond combat. It was about perceiving the world with clarity, seeing the truth before the opponent moved, acting without hesitation or doubt. To draw the sword was to reveal one's soul, and so a warrior was taught to empty his mind, to become calm as still water. Only then could his movements be pure and unstoppable. The katana itself, long and curved, was designed not just for killing, but for elegance. It sliced with fluid grace, capable of cutting through armor and bone in a single motion. It was paired with the shorter wakizashi, used for close combat or ritual suicide. Together, they formed the daisho, the symbol of samurai rank. A man without his swords was a man without identity. When entering another's home, a samurai would unfasten them and lay them before him as a gesture of trust, though always within reach, for even in peace, vigilance was eternal. The sword also defined the rituals of death. When a samurai took his own life in seppuku, it was often with his wakizashi, performed with steady hands and clear mind. His sword was witness to his honor, his final companion as he crossed into the next world. It was said that a true warrior should never fear death, for to die with honor was to live forever. The sword, gleaming beneath the candlelight, stood as the silent keeper of that ideal. But beyond the battlefield and ritual, the sword shaped the very spirit of Japanese culture. Its philosophy of balance and precision echoed in art, poetry, and tea ceremony. Just as a warrior honed his sword, so too did artists hone their brush, monks their chants, and craftsmen their tools. The same ideals focus, purity, and harmony guided all who sought mastery. The blade, in this sense, was not just steel, it was a mirror of the soul, striving toward perfection. Yet not all who lived by the sword found glory. Many samurai died nameless, their blades rusting in forgotten fields. Others turned their skill to darker purposes, banditry, assassination, or rebellion. The sword gave power, but it demanded control, and those who wielded it without wisdom were consumed by it. Even the greatest masters spoke of humility before the blade, warning that arrogance could destroy a man faster than any enemy. To truly follow the way of the sword was to understand death intimately and to live in peace with it. For those outside the samurai class, the sword was both awe and terror. Peasants bowed low when warriors passed, careful not to offend. To see a sword drawn was to witness something sacred and final, a moment when fate unfolded in an instant. The gleam of a blade under sunlight could silence a crowd. Its presence alone a reminder of how fragile life truly was. If you were to hold a samurai's sword for even a moment, you would feel its weight not only in your hands, but in your heart. You would sense the years of discipline behind its creation, the prayers of the smith, the meditations of its owner, the blood it may have seen. You would know that it was more than metal. It was memory, devotion, and destiny forged into form. To wield it without understanding would be sacrilege. To master it would require surrendering your very self. The way of the sword was the way of life and death. It was a path of silence and control, beauty and brutality. In the gleam of the blade, one could see both the light of enlightenment and the shadow of mortality. And for the samurai, that balance between peace and violence, between life and death, was the essence of existence itself. Even in times of peace, the air of feudal Japan was heavy with the memory of war. It lingered in the stories told around fires, in the scars carried by old men, and in the distant clang of swords being sharpened for battles that had not yet come. From the rise of the first shoguns to the long calm of the Tokugawa era, the threat of conflict never truly vanished. It only slept, waiting for the sound of drums to wake it again. Every person, from the peasant in his field to the samurai in his armor, lived with the unspoken truth that war was not an exception to life. It was part of its rhythm. In the centuries before peace was firmly established, Japan was a land divided by power and ambition. Daimyo ruled over fragmented domains, each one seeking to expand its influence. Castles rose upon hilltops, rivers became borders, and every alliance was a fragile bridge over suspicion. Betrayal was common, and trust was rare. The banners of warlords, painted with bold crests, fluttered across the land as armies marched to seize territory, rice, and glory. The clash of steel and the cry of the dying echoed through forests and valleys, turning the earth itself into a witness of endless struggle. A peasant's life could change overnight. One day, he might be tending his crops. The next, soldiers could appear on the horizon, demanding food, conscripts, or shelter. Villages were burned, fields trampled, families scattered. The smoke of war carried no distinction between loyal and rebel. It consumed all. To survive meant to be silent, to bow, to obey whichever banner the wind carried. After armies passed, famine often followed. Ash replaced harvest, and the survivors were left to rebuild among ruins. For those born without power, war was not glory, it was chaos. For the samurai, however, war was purpose. Their entire existence revolved around readiness for battle. From childhood, they trained in weapons, strategy, and endurance. They studied the art of war, learned to read the movements of the enemy, and memorized formations and signals. To die in service was to fulfill their destiny. Yet even for them, the battlefield was not the place of romantic honor that poetry described. It was mud and screams and fear cloaked in duty. The sharp scent of blood mingled with sweat and earth, and arrows rained from the sky like deadly rain. The samurai's code demanded calm even in horror, control even in chaos. He was to die without regret and kill without cruelty. But in the heat of war, ideals were often drowned beneath survival. Battles in feudal Japan were both ritual and slaughter. At dawn, drums thundered, conch shells blared, and banners waved in brilliant colors as each side announced its lineage and intent. Samurai introduced themselves by name before charging into combat, a practice rooted in honor, but often ending in death before the words were finished. The armies were not vast by modern standards, yet they moved with precision, each man bound to his role. Foot soldiers known as ashigaru advanced with spears and bows, their armor made of leather and iron plates tied with cords. Behind them rode the mounted samurai, cutting through the chaos with curved blades that flashed like lightning. Victory was not measured by survival, but by loyalty, and to retreat was to invite shame that could last generations. The daimyo who commanded these armies played a more dangerous game. Every alliance was temporary, every promise uncertain. Spies and assassins moved in the shadows, and secret letters could determine the rise or fall of entire clans. The Sengoku period, known as the Age of Warring States, saw decades of unending conflict, where brothers turned against brothers and villages became battlefields. The strong devoured the weak until one by one, the great unifiers Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu brought the land under a single rule. But even after peace was declared, the memory of bloodshed remained carved into the collective mind. War shaped everything. Castles were built like fortresses of stone and pride, with walls that rose above rivers and moats wide enough to reflect the sky. Villages were arranged for defense, fields positioned near strongholds for easy protection. Weapons were crafted not just for battle, but as works of art: the katana, the yari spear, the yumi bow, all symbols of mastery and identity. Even during peace, these weapons were maintained, polished, and honored, for no one believed peace would last forever. The peasantry carried the heaviest burden of all. They paid taxes to fund wars they would never see the end of. Their labor turned into rice that fed soldiers and fueled ambition. When armies marched, they took more than supplies. They took sons, daughters, and homes. Some peasants fled to the mountains, becoming bandits or wanderers. Others joined militias, defending their villages with bamboo spears and desperate courage. Still others bowed to the inevitable and prayed that their children might one day live in quieter times. Every lull in war felt temporary, like the stillness between thunderclaps. Even religion could not escape war's reach. Temples housed warrior monks, the Sohei, who fought to protect their faith or their land. They wielded naginata and bows with the same devotion they once gave to prayer. The line between monk and soldier blurred until both were one and the same. The mountains that had once offered refuge now echoed with battle cries. War consumed even the sacred. When the Tokugawa shogunate finally brought order to Japan, an uneasy peace settled over the land. The swords were sheathed, the banners stored, but the structure of war remained. The samurai, now without battles to fight, turned to bureaucracy and ritual, maintaining discipline through duty rather than bloodshed. Yet in their hearts, many longed for the chaos they were trained to master. A warrior without war is a blade without purpose. The peace they preserved was as fragile as the paper walls of their homes. If you lived a day in feudal Japan, you would feel war's shadow even in silence. The songs sung at harvest festivals would carry the rhythm of marching feet. The temple bells that rang for prayer would echo like war drums in your memory. The old men who told stories by firelight would speak of battles fought long ago, their voices trembling not from fear, but from reverence for the code that bound them to the past. To live under the constant threat of war was to understand impermanence more deeply than most. Peace was never trusted, and death was never far. The cherry blossoms that fell each spring reminded all who saw them that beauty and life were brief, and that to live honorably, even for a moment, was to triumph over time itself. In the world of feudal Japan, war was not just a matter of armies and weapons. It was a condition of the soul, a reminder that life, like the sword, was always poised on the edge between calm and chaos, and that only through discipline could one endure its sharpest edge. The rhythm of life in feudal Japan was measured not by wealth or freedom, but by the seasons. Each season carried its own trials, blessings, and cruelties, shaping how people lived, worked, and survived. To endure through the year was to endure through an endless cycle of labor and uncertainty, a delicate balance between nature, its generosity, and its mercilessness. The people of Japan lived close to the land, bound to it by necessity and reverence. But nature, beautiful as it was, could be both provider and destroyer. The changing seasons were both a promise and a warning. Spring began not with ease, but with urgency. It was the time of planting, of renewal and preparation. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet soil and cherry blossoms. Peasants rose before dawn to flood the rice paddies, their reflections shimmering on the water as they planted each seedling by hand. The work was backbreaking, but filled with quiet hope. The success of the harvest depended on these early weeks, when rain and sunlight had to fall in perfect balance. Too much water meant rot. Too little meant death. Farmers prayed to the gods for favorable weather, leaving offerings of rice and sake at shrines hidden among the trees. Even samurai and lords paid respect to the cycles of nature, for the rice that fed their armies began with the sweat of peasants in the mud. But spring was also unpredictable. Late frosts could kill young plants, storms could flood the paddies, and pests could spread unseen. Every farmer learned to read the wind and the clouds, to sense when danger was near. They moved with caution, guided by centuries of tradition. To live in harmony with nature was to survive. To defy it was to perish. Summer was a time of both abundance and peril. The fields grew thick with green, and the air was heavy with humidity. Cicadas sang from dawn until dusk, their relentless chorus filling the countryside. Yet beneath the beauty, hardship lingered. The heat bred illness and exhaustion. Mosquitoes swarmed in the paddies, spreading disease. Food spoiled quickly, and fires broke out in towns and villages where wooden homes stood close together. To work under the summer sun was to feel the weight of the season pressing on every bone. Still, life continued. Children helped carry water, women cooked over open flames, and men waded through the fields from sunrise until the last light faded. The summer festivals offered brief respite dances, drums, and laughter under the lanterns, but even celebration was laced with the knowledge that storms could come at any moment. And when they came with fury. Typhoons swept across the islands, bringing winds that tore roofs from houses and rain that drowned the fields. Rivers overflowed, washing away bridges and homes. Entire harvests could vanish in a single night. Villagers clung to what they could save, rebuilding again and again, their resilience as steady as the mountains that watched over them. After each storm, they swept away the debris, bowed their heads in prayer, and began once more. Autumn brought a sense of both relief and melancholy. The heat faded, the air grew crisp, and the fields turned golden as the rice ripened for harvest. This was the most important season of all, the moment when a year's labor was measured and judged. Families worked together to cut and dry the stalks, their hands moving in practiced rhythm. The smell of fresh straw filled the air. Songs rose from the fields, simple melodies of gratitude and exhaustion. The harvest festival, held after the work was done, was the most joyful time of the year. Lanterns lit the night, sake flowed freely, and villagers gave thanks to the gods for their mercy. Yet behind every smile lay quiet calculation. Would the yield be enough to pay the taxes? Would there be enough left to last through winter? The weight of survival never truly lifted. Winter, when it came, was a season of silence and scarcity. The landscape turned gray and still, the air biting cold. Snow blanketed the fields, and rivers froze over. Work in the paddies stopped, replaced by the labor of survival. Families gathered around hearth fires, burning what little wood they had stored. Meals grew smaller barley, mixed with leftover rice. Pickled vegetables stretched their limits. Hunger pressed on every stomach, and illness stalked the villages like a ghost. The elderly often gave up their portions so the young might live. Yet in this stillness, there was also peace. Life slowed, and families drew close. Stories were told by the firelight, prayers whispered to ancestors. Winter was a test of endurance, but also a reminder that even hardship had beauty. The hush of falling snow, the glow of lanterns through frosted windows, the comfort of shared warmth. For those who lived under harsher conditions on the mountain slopes or in remote fishing villages, the seasons were even more unforgiving. Fishermen braved icy seas in fragile boats, their lives dependent on the moods of the waves. Woodcutters climbed steep paths through snow and rain, risking their lives for a few bundles of timber. Monks in secluded temples endured months of isolation, meditating in unheated halls, their breath visible in the cold air. Every life, no matter how different, was shaped by the same rhythm, the endless turning of the seasons, the dance between hunger and hope. Even the samurai, though protected by status, could not escape nature's reach. Famine and drought did not spare castles. The storehouses could empty faster than expected, and rice stipends could dwindle when crops failed. The daimyo and his retainers might feast in autumn, only to ration by spring. Nature ignored rank and privilege alike. In this way, All people of Japan, peasant, merchant, warrior, or monk, were united by the same dependence, the same humility before the earth. If you were to live a year in feudal Japan, you would come to know the seasons not as mere weather, but as forces of destiny. You would feel the sting of rain in your skin, the ache of frost in your bones, and the warmth of the first spring breeze after months of cold. You would watch the cherry blossoms bloom and fall, understanding why they were seen as symbols of life itself brief, beautiful, and beyond control. Each season would remind you of how fragile existence was, and how endurance was its own kind of wisdom. The people of feudal Japan did not fight the seasons, they lived within them. They accepted hardship as part of the natural order, finding grace in perseverance. The earth gave and the earth took, and humanity bowed in reverence to both. To last a single year in that world was to understand that life was not about conquest, but about balance. The seasons, in all their cruelty and beauty, taught the people to survive with patience, to labor without complaint, and to cherish every fleeting moment of peace between storms. Behind every great daimyo, every disciplined samurai, and every elegant lady of the castle, there existed an unseen army, the servants. They were the invisible hands that kept the wheels of feudal Japan turning. They cooked, cleaned, carried, and obeyed, moving quietly through corridors, gardens, and courtyards like shadows. Their names were rarely recorded, their faces forgotten by history, but their labor formed the foundation upon which the entire society rested. To live as a servant was to live in silence, devotion, and constant awareness of one's place. The life of a servant began early, often in childhood. Many were born into families that had served the same household for generations. Others came from peasant villages, sent by their families in hopes of earning security or favor. From the moment they entered service, they were bound not by written contracts, but by loyalty and unspoken understanding that their life was not their own. They rose before dawn, worked until night, and slept in small quarters near the kitchens or stables, ready to answer a call at any hour. Their world revolved around duty, and their value lay in their obedience. Inside a daimyo's castle, the hierarchy of servants was as rigid as the hierarchy outside its walls. At the top were senior attendants, trusted men and women who managed the inner workings of the household. Beneath them were cooks, cleaners, gardeners, and messengers. The lowest of all were the laborers and errand boys who fetched water, chopped wood, and carried waste. Every task had its own ritual. Floors were polished with rice husks, tatami mats brushed in perfect lines, and meals prepared with the precision of ceremony. A misplaced utensil or an overheard whisper could cost a servant their position or worse. In the women's quarters, maids served the wives and daughters of the samurai elite. They dressed their mistresses in silk kimonos, styled their hair with delicate pins, and assisted in the tea ceremony. They learned to move gracefully, to anticipate needs before words were spoken, and to remain invisible except when summoned. Their loyalty was to their lady, but their fate was tied to the mood of the lord. A single rumor or suspicion could change everything. Some maids rose through trust to positions of quiet influence. Others vanished into dismissal and poverty with no explanation. Male servants, too, lived lives of strict obedience. Some served directly under samurai as attendants, polishing armor, maintaining swords, and assisting in travel. These men often developed deep loyalty to their masters, sometimes even following them into death. It was not unheard of for a servant to commit suicide after their lord's passing, believing their duty continued beyond the grave. Others worked in the outer areas of the estate, tending stables, managing livestock, or guarding the gates. They were close to power, yet forever outside it, standing on the edge of privilege they could never share. Servants were required to maintain perfect composure. They could not express frustration, fatigue, or desire. Their emotions belonged to their masters. They bowed deeply, spoke softly, and memorized the rules of etiquette that governed every gesture. To make eye contact with a superior without permission was insolence. To speak out of turn was dangerous. The walls of castles and estates heard everything, and gossip was a silent currency that could destroy lives. A wise servant learned to listen without listening, to see without seeing. Their survival depended on discretion. The work itself was constant and grueling. In the kitchens, cooks labored over wood-fired stoves, their faces slick with sweat as they prepared elaborate meals for feasts and ceremonies. The smell of roasted fish and steaming rice filled the air, mingling with the smoke of burning charcoal. Servants cleaned endlessly sweeping gardens, scrubbing floors, replacing tatami mats, and polishing every surface until it gleamed. During winter, their hands cracked from cold water. During summer, they endured unbearable heat. There was no rest, no recognition, only the quiet pride of doing one's duty well. Beyond the castle walls, servants filled the households of samurai, merchants, and even temples. They ran errands through crowded streets, carried messages, and assisted in daily rituals. In temple compounds, acolytes swept courtyards and tended lamps, learning humility through endless repetition. In merchant homes, clerks balanced ledgers by candlelight, while housemaids prepared meals for families who often treated them as invisible. The life of service extended to every corner of society, uniting people of all backgrounds through the shared rhythm of work. Some servants found solace in the small moments between tasks. The sound of the wind through bamboo, the sight of the moon over the castle walls, the warmth of shared laughter when no one was watching. Friendships formed in whispers, and quiet romances bloomed in the shadows. But such bonds were fragile and dangerous. If discovered, punishment was swift. Love was a luxury reserved for the free, and servants were not free. Yet in their hearts, they found ways to dream. A better life, a kind master, a small measure of dignity. Dreams kept them alive when obedience alone could not. For the most loyal servants, rewards did exist. A trusted attendant might be granted land or a modest house upon old age. A favored maid could receive gifts of clothing or jewelry, rare tokens of gratitude. But these were exceptions. Most servants grew old within the same walls they entered as children, their hands wrinkled, their backs bent, their names forgotten once they were gone. Theirs was a quiet existence, one of devotion, humility, and acceptance. To live a single day as a servant in feudal Japan would test both body and spirit. You would rise before dawn, your breath visible in the cold air, your tasks already waiting. You would move silently through corridors, aware of every sound, every command, every unspoken rule. You would bow until your neck ached, your hands raw from labor. You would eat quickly, sleep lightly, and dream rarely. And yet, if you endured, you might come to understand the strength that lies in service, not the strength of dominance, but of perseverance, patience, and pride in unseen labor. The servants of feudal Japan were not warriors, scholars, or lords. They held no titles, no lands, and no voices in history. But they were the quiet pulse of that world, the ones who sustained the living and honored the dead. Their world was one of silence and submission, yet within it lived a resilience as enduring as stone. Though history may have forgotten their names, the world they built with their hands still stands in the calm grace of temples, the polished floors of castles, and the unseen order of a society built upon their silent devotion. Beneath the order, discipline, and ritual that defined feudal Japan lay another world, one that whispered instead of bowed, laughed instead of saluted, and sought fleeting joy in the shadows of duty. It was a world of forbidden pleasures, where the strict codes of society gave way, if only for a moment, to the desires and hungers that every human heart carried. In the stillness of temples and the silence of castles, these pleasures were denied. But in the towns, behind paper screens and down lantern-lit alleys, they bloomed in secret. For most people, Life in feudal Japan was shaped by restraint. The samurai were bound by bushido, the peasants by survival, the monks by devotion. Yet, even in this world of obedience, people longed for escape from fear, from labor, from the constant pressure of duty. And so, pleasure found its own paths, through art, through love, through indulgence, and through illusion. It was in the contrast between hardship and beauty that these forbidden worlds came alive. The floating world Yukio was the name given to these places of escape. It meant the world in transition, a realm of fleeting delights that reflected life's impermanence. The term captured both beauty and melancholy, a recognition that joy, like the cherry blossom, was brief and destined to fall. In the pleasure quarters of cities like Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka, this philosophy became reality. Streets lined with red lanterns came alive at night, filled with the scent of incense, grilled fish, and perfume. Shamisen music drifted through the air, and laughter spilled from tea houses where men and women played their parts in the theater of desire. At the heart of this world were the courtesans, the oiran, whose beauty and refinement were legendary. Unlike the crude prostitutes who served the desperate, the oiran were artists of conversation, fashion, and intellect. They dressed in elaborate silk kimono embroidered with gold, and wore towering hairstyles adorned with combs and pins. To spend an evening with an oiran was not simply an act of indulgence. It was an experience of art, poetry, and theater combined. They recited poems, played music, and discussed philosophy, their wit as sharp as their beauty. Yet behind the silk and smiles was a life of confinement. Their days were dictated by the rules of the pleasure houses, their freedom traded for luxury. They belonged to patrons, their worth measured by the price of an hour's company. Geisha, too, became symbols of refined pleasure. Originating as entertainers rather than courtesans, they were trained in the arts of performance, tea ceremony, and dance. They brought laughter to banquets, grace to celebrations, and a kind of companionship that transcended desire. A geisha's world was one of illusion, where elegance hid loneliness and laughter masked control. She could never marry a client, could never truly belong to the world she served. Her charm was her armor, and her art was her survival. Though geisha were admired and envied, their lives were bound by contracts and expectations as strict as any samurai's oath. Pleasure in feudal Japan was not only found in company. It lived in art, in food, and in the delicate rituals of daily life. The tea ceremony itself, though spiritual in essence, held a sensual beauty. The slow movements, the careful pouring of water, the sound of bamboo whisking matcha into foam. It was a meditation on simplicity, but also a celebration of presence. To sip tea in silence was to taste peace itself, to feel the warmth of the cup and the coolness of the air in perfect balance. In a world of chaos, such moments became rare luxuries. For the common people, pleasure took humbler forms. In the narrow streets of towns, vendors sold skewers of roasted eel, steamed buns, and sweet rice cakes. Sake flowed freely in taverns where merchants, travelers, and farmers gathered to forget their troubles for a night. Drunken laughter echoed under the glow of paper lanterns as men and women traded stories and songs. Music, too, carried pleasure, the sound of taiko drums at festivals, flutes in the night air, and the rhythmic chants of workers in the fields. Even a single cup of warm sake on a cold evening could feel like an act of rebellion against hardship. Festivals brought moments of collective joy. They transformed villages and cities alike into realms of color and noise. Paper lanterns swayed, dancers twirled in yukata robes, and the scent of grilled food filled the night. For a few days each year, even the most rigid hierarchies seemed to dissolve. Peasants, merchants, and samurai mingled among the crowds, united in celebration. Drums thundered, masks hid faces, and laughter replaced silence. It was a fleeting freedom, a reminder that joy could exist even in a world of strict order. Yet every pleasure carried risk. For the samurai, indulgence could lead to disgrace. For a monk, it could mean spiritual ruin. For the poor, it could mean debt and hunger. The floating world offered beauty, but it demanded a price. Many who entered its glow were consumed by it, losing their fortunes, reputations, or lives to the endless pursuit of escape. The streets that shone at night were empty by dawn, their revelers scattered back to lives of duty and regret. But perhaps that was the point. The people of feudal Japan understood that nothing lasted, not beauty, not love, not even sorrow. To seek pleasure was to accept that truth, to grasp something precious before it vanished. In the art of ukiyo-e, woodblock prints captured these fleeting moments, the curve of a geisha's smile, the glint of moonlight on sake cups, the blush of morning after a night of laughter. Each print was both celebration and elegy, a frozen glimpse of impermanence. If you lived a day in that world, you would feel the strange mix of restraint and longing that defined it. You might walk through a quiet street by day, where monks chanted and merchants bartered, then return at night to find it alive with color, song, and perfume. You would hear the soft pluck of a shamisen, the low murmur of voices, the flutter of silk against the floor. You might sipsake beneath lantern light, knowing that when dawn came, the world would return to its rules and silence. But for that moment, you would feel alive, untethered, unjudged, and free. The forbidden pleasures of feudal Japan were not merely indulgences. They were acts of defiance against impermanence, a way for people to remind themselves that even in a life ruled by duty and hardship, beauty could still bloom, if only for a night. And though the lanterns would eventually fade, the memory of their light lingered, glowing softly in the hearts of those who once dared to seek joy in a world that demanded silence. In a society built upon loyalty, structure, and unbroken chains of obedience, there existed a figure that stood apart, the ronin, the masterless samurai. To be a ronin was to live between worlds, a wanderer without allegiance, a man stripped of identity and purpose. Once proud retainers of powerful lords, they became drifters when those lords fell or cast them aside. The loss of one's master was not only a political misfortune, it was a spiritual death. In feudal Japan, where a man's worth was defined by whom he served, the ronin lived as ghosts of the old order, carrying both their swords and their shame. The word ronin itself meant wave man, one who drifted like a wave upon the sea, directionless and untethered. For many samurai, becoming a ronin was the greatest humiliation imaginable. Their swords might remain sharp, their armor intact, but their place in the hierarchy was gone. Some lost their masters in battle, others through political betrayal, and still others through their own failure. A samurai without a lord was like a sword without a sheath, dangerous, unstable, and feared. The Bushido code taught loyalty unto death, but a ronin lived on, bound by neither duty nor belonging. Life as a ronin was a struggle for both body and soul. Without a stipend of rice or land, many fell into poverty. They wandered from province to province, seeking employment as guards, teachers, or bodyguards for merchants and travelers. Some joined bandit gangs, others became mercenaries in distant wars. In cities, a few opened schools to teach swordsmanship to commoners, an act once unthinkable for samurai. But most lived quietly, wearing faded robes, their swords wrapped in cloth to hide the shame of their status. They carried themselves with dignity, but the world looked upon them with suspicion. To the common people, ronin were both respected and feared. Their mastery of the sword made them dangerous, yet their fall from grace made them unpredictable. A single ronin could strike down a samurai of rank, yet he might also beg for food or sleep beneath bridges. Some were noble souls who clung to the old ideals of honor, even in poverty. Others abandoned the code entirely, turning to violence or deceit. The ronin's path was as varied as the waves that named them, some calm, some raging, all restless. Among the Ronin, a few became legends. None more so than the 47 who avenged their fallen master in one of Japan's most enduring tales of loyalty and sacrifice. When their daimyo was unjustly ordered to commit seppuku, his retainers became Ronin, cast out and dishonored. But instead of fading into obscurity, they waited in silence for over a year, disguising themselves as beggars and tradesmen. Then, one snowy night, they struck storming the mansion of the man responsible for their lord's death. They killed him, laid his head upon their master's grave, and turned themselves in to face execution. The story of the 47 Ronin became the perfect paradox. Men who broke the law in order to uphold honor. They died as criminals, yet were remembered as heroes. Their tale became a legend, a reminder that even in disgrace, loyalty could burn brighter than any flame. But not all Ronin were guided by such purpose. Many wandered endlessly, haunted by their failures. Some became gamblers, drifting from tavern to tavern, their swords more ornament than weapon. Others sold their services to corrupt officials or criminal gangs, their skills twisted into tools of oppression. In the cities, Ronin were often found in the smoky back rooms of sake houses, their voices low and bitter, reminiscing about wars long over. The clang of their swords against the floor was the echo of a world that no longer wanted them. Yet, amid the despair, there were those who found peace in solitude. Some Ronin became monks, trading the sword for prayer beads. They saw their loss not as curse, but as liberation, from duty, from pride, from the endless cycle of obedience. They wandered mountain temples, seeking enlightenment instead of employment. The discipline that once served the blade now served the spirit. These men found meaning not in service to a master, but in service to truth itself. The path of the Ronin was one of contradiction. They were both free and lost, powerful and powerless, feared and pitied. To be without a master meant freedom from hierarchy, but also from belonging. Freedom in feudal Japan was not a gift, it was exile. The Ronin embodied the tension between the ideals of Bushido and the realities of survival. They walked through a world that demanded loyalty, even when there was no one left to give it to. In appearance, many Ronin tried to preserve the dignity of their past. Their clothing might be worn, their armor pawned, but their posture remained upright, their gaze steady. They carried 2 swords, though sometimes the shorter one was sold for food. A true Ronin still bowed deeply to the temple, still polished his blade each morning, still whispered his prayers to ancestors who would never answer. His life was reduced to its essence: discipline, without direction, honor without reward. If you lived a day as a Ronin, you would know the ache of isolation. You would wake under the gray sky with no orders to follow, your next meal uncertain. You would walk the road between provinces, passing farmers who bowed in fear, merchants who hurried past, and samurai who refused to meet your eyes. You would feel both pride and shame as your hand brushed the hilt of your sword, a reminder of who you once were and who you could no longer be. At night, you might share a drink with other wanderers, speaking softly of the days when your banner still flew, your name still mattered. The Ronin's life was not meant to last, but many endured longer than the world expected. Some found redemption through small acts of kindness, defending a village from bandits, teaching a boy to read, helping a stranger without reason. These moments, though fleeting, became their form of salvation. They proved that even without a master, a man could still live with integrity, still find purpose in a world that had cast him aside. The Ronin were outcasts, but they were also reminders of impermanence, the idea that all power, all honor, all order eventually fades. Their wandering lives reflected the fragility of the very system that had created them. In their solitude, they carried the wisdom of detachment, the pain of loss, and the quiet dignity of endurance. And though history remembered them as fallen men, they were, in truth, reflections of Japan itself, beautiful, disciplined, tragic, and forever in search of balance between loyalty and freedom, between honor and survival. In a world built on duty and order, escape was both impossible and irresistible. Every class, every person in feudal Japan, samurai, peasant, monk, or servant, lived within walls, invisible but unbreakable. To step beyond one's station was to defy heaven's design. Yet, in every quiet village, every crowded castle, and every hidden mountain path, there were those who dreamed of freedom. They dreamed of walking beyond the rice fields, beyond the taxes and rituals, beyond the endless bowing and obedience. They dreamed of becoming no one and everyone at once, free from name, from rank, from the weight of history. But in feudal Japan, to dream of escape was itself a rebellion. For the peasant, escape often began as fantasy whispered beneath the stars after a long day in the fields. The back ached, the hands were raw, and the stomach was never full. But when the fire burned low and the children slept, some dared to imagine a life beyond their lord's land, a life where rice belonged to those who planted it, where storms did not dictate fate. Some actually tried. They slipped away at night, walking barefoot through forests, following rivers that led to nowhere. Yet Japan was a tightly woven world. Domains were guarded, villages bound by law. Travelers without permits were questioned, detained, or worse. Those caught became examples, their punishment displayed for all to see. Freedom, for most peasants, remained a distant shimmer on the horizon, beautiful and unreachable. Still, some succeeded. There were tales of farmers who vanished into the mountains and became hunters, or who reached distant ports and found new lives as fishermen or traders. Others joined outlaw bands that roamed the countryside, living beyond the law but free from feudal chains. These were the nameless people who no longer belonged to any class. They risked starvation and capture every day, yet for them, even a short life of freedom was worth more than a long life of servitude. For samurai, escape was more complicated. Bound by honor, their chains were forged not of law, but of pride. To abandon one's lord was the greatest shame. And yet, not every lord was just. Some samurai faced impossible orders, commands to punish the innocent, to collect unbearable taxes, or to wage senseless war. To disobey was treason. To obey was dishonor. In such conflict, a few chose exile. They shed their armor, cast aside their crests, and vanished into anonymity. Some became monks, trading their swords for prayer beads. Others became ronin, wandering without master or destination. And a few simply disappeared, living among peasants under false names, their true identities buried like forgotten graves. To live without honor was agony, but for those who could no longer bear the weight of the code, escape was a different kind of death, a release from a life that had become unbearable. Among women, the dream of escape was even more fragile. Their lives were confined by walls both physical and social. A samurai's wife might gaze beyond the castle gardens, wondering what lay past the mountains she would never see. A peasant woman might stare at the river that marked the edge of her village and imagine drifting away with its current. For some, the temple offered the only path to freedom. To shave one's head and take vows was to abandon the world, to renounce obedience to husband and family alike. Yet even there, discipline replaced duty. The world outside remained forbiddance, and the silence of devotion could feel like another kind of prison. Others took darker paths, fleeing marriages, disguising themselves as men, or vanishing into the pleasure districts, where they could at least own their names, even if for a price. Escape for a woman was often not from the world, but from being unseen within it. For monks and hermits, escape took another form entirely, the rejection of the world itself. Some withdrew from society, seeking enlightenment in isolation. They saw the endless cycles of duty and desire as illusions to be transcended. Theirs was a spiritual escape, not of body, but of mind. They sought freedom in emptiness, in detachment from the self. High in the mountains, in caves surrounded by clouds, they lived in silence. Their only possessions a bowl, a robe, and a prayer. To the people below, these wanderers seemed both holy and mad. Yet perhaps they had achieved what others could only dream of, a life unbound by law or desire. Even among the merchants and artisans, the longing to escape stirred quietly. They worked tirelessly to maintain their place in society, but the walls of hierarchy pressed close. Wealth without respect, success without status, it was a gilded cage. Some merchants sought escape through art, sponsoring plays, poetry, and paintings that celebrated impermanence and pleasure. The floating world of the pleasure quarters was, in its own way, a collective act of escape, a dream where class dissolved, if only until dawn. Through laughter, music, and love, they forgot the weight of rank. But like the paper lanterns that lit their nights, the illusion burned brightly and briefly before vanishing into darkness. There were also those who turned to the sea. The coastline of Japan, long and winding, offered both danger and promise. Fishermen and traders whispered stories of distant lands beyond the waves, Korea, China, even islands unknown. The shogunate forbade travel beyond the borders, sealing the nation from the outside world. Yet some tried, defying the edicts of death. Smugglers, sailors, and wanderers sought a life where no lord ruled, where no tax was owed. Many perished in storms, their boats swallowed by the sea, but their stories drifted back to shore like ghosts, reminders that somewhere beyond the horizon, freedom might exist. If you lived in feudal Japan, the dream of escape would find you eventually. Perhaps it would visit you at night, in the hush between one breath and the next. Perhaps it would come when you watched the cherry blossoms fall, their beauty gone too soon. You would feel it in the ache of your muscles, in the quiet of the fields, in the endless repetition of days. You would wonder what lay beyond the mountains, beyond duty, beyond fear. But to chase that dream would mean leaving behind everything you knew: family, name, and the fragile safety of belonging. And so most people stayed. They endured. They bowed, they prayed, they lived and died within the same narrow borders that had contained their ancestors. But inside their hearts, the dream remained alive, a silent rebellion that no law could erase. It was the spark that kept them human, the whisper that told them there might be something more. For some, that whisper became a prayer, for others, a story, and for a rare few, it became a journey. The dream of escape in feudal Japan was not just about leaving a place, it was about transcending a life. It was the yearning for freedom in a world built on obedience. The quiet defiance of the spirit had refused to be broken. And though few ever succeeded in leaving, the dream itself endured, passed down through generations like a secret flame, small, flickering, but eternal. As the story of feudal Japan draws to a close, the echoes of its world still linger, the sound of a temple bell fading in the mist, the creak of bamboo in the wind, the rustle of silk as a samurai kneels in silence. It was a world of beauty and brutality, discipline and despair, bound by laws of loyalty, and softened only by fleeting moments of peace. Every life, from the highest lord to the humblest peasant, was part of a vast, intricate order where duty outweighed desire and honor outweighed happiness. To live even a single day in that world would have required not just strength, but surrender, a surrender to hierarchy, to hardship, and to fate itself. The people of feudal Japan lived within limits that we can scarcely imagine today. Their days were measured by obligation, their futures written at birth. Yet within those boundaries, they carved lives of astonishing depth and grace. They found beauty in simplicity, meaning in repetition, and purpose in obedience. Their art, their poetry, and their rituals reflected a deep understanding of impermanence, that all things, no matter how glorious or painful, must one day fade. The falling cherry blossom, the rippling blade, the quiet bough were reminders that nothing lasts, and that to live with dignity in the face of that truth was the highest art of all. If you were to stand in that world now, looking upon its mountains, its temples, and its fields, you might feel its silence settle over you, a silence that speaks of centuries of endurance. You might hear the faint hum of a monk's chant, or the distant crack of a smith's hammer, and understand that every sound carried meaning. It was a world both harsh and sacred, where life itself was ceremony. And though we would not last a day there, those who did taught us something timeless. That discipline can shape beauty, that suffering can coexist with peace, and that even within the strictest order, the human spirit continues to dream. As you drift toward rest, imagine the lanterns glowing softly in the night, the villages asleep, the mountains still, and the stars watching as they always have. Let the past settle around you like quiet rain, each drop a story, each echo a life once lived. The people of feudal Japan have long since turned to dust, but their world remains, whispering through the centuries in the rustle of paper screens and the rhythm of old poems. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, I invite you to stay a little longer in our world. Subscribe to History for Sleep, where each night we explore another chapter of